this point, and I am the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Strategic Planning at the Law School, and I'm also involved in the compliance program. I have the pleasure today of introducing David Hess. He is the Everett E. Berg Professor of Business Administration and Professor of Business Law at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. He has taught a variety of courses on business law, business ethics, business and human rights, corporate governance, corporate social responsibility and negotiations, and his work primarily focuses on the role of law in ensuring corporate accountability. He has a wide range of publications in this area and has analyzed the use of non-financial reporting by corporations, efforts to combat corruption in international business, the link between corruption and business and human rights due diligence, modern slavery in the global supply chains, and the use of corporate monitors in criminal settlements, and finally the role of compliance and ethics in creating more ethical corporate cultures. So a wonderful variety of scholarship. This research has been published in leading law, ethics, and management journals and has been recognized with national awards such as the Faculty Pioneer Award from the Aspen Institute. He is the author of the 2024 book, Advanced Introduction to Corporate Compliance, which is a wonderful foundational text. He has a JD from the University of Iowa and then a master's and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And he will be talking about designing for integrity how law, organizational culture, and psychology intersect in compliance. And please, Sharon, join me in welcoming David Hess.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me here. Hopefully my talk isn't too basic, but the general idea is I wanted to give kind of an introduction to how I think about compliance and ethics programs, how I would teach it to our MBA students, and sort of this amorphous concept of corporate culture. What does that mean? Is it really that complex or not? And then how we can use some of the insights from behavioral ethics to sort of piece together what exactly corporate culture means and how we can move forward. So, there we go. Make sure it turned up. So the older view of corporate compliance, right, is much more, what are the policies? People need to know what the rules are so they don't break the rules, and that's it. But now it's much, much broader. We try to think about anything that can impact organizational life. Compliance really should be thinking about that and having their hands in that as well, because that's going to impact people. So, the old view is, kind of just keep employees from violating the rules, but now we need to think about how can we also make it easier for people to do the right thing, not just prevent people from doing something wrong, but help people lead ethical lives within their organizations. So if you're familiar with James Ress' model, Psychology of Moral Decision Making, he talks about there's sort of 4 ways that people mess up, right? They don't do the right thing. So it could be moral blindness. I didn't know that was an issue. I didn't know that was a problem. Somebody would have told me, I wouldn't have done it, right? I didn't know what the rules were. I wasn't aware there was an issue. If you've done that, you're aware of the issue. Then you've got to still figure out, exercise good judgment, right? So defective reasoning. You didn't think about the problem correctly. Third one, self-interest, peer pressure. So you've done the first 2. You're aware of the issue. You know what the right thing is to do, but my team's pushing me to do something else. Or I make more money for myself and my team if I do something, do what I know is wrong. And then the last one would be, it can be tough to do the right thing. So you've done the first 3 steps and you're like, I'm going to go in and tell my supervisor or boss what's going on and how I'm not going to do that. And you get in there and you're like, yeah, nope, I'm not doing that. I hope somebody else tells them, right? So you have to have the courage to follow through, as well as the interpersonal skills, political skills to try to get things done. So the James Ress model, right, you need to have awareness, judgment, motivation, and character, courage, and personal skills to go from recognizing an ethical issue to actually doing it. Compliance programs used to just focus mostly on the first 2. Here are the rules, here's how you, on the issue, this is what you do, but it needs to attend to all aspects of moral decision making, as well as the organizational life situation. So how did we get to this point where we talk about cultures of compliance? I got so many C words in my slides, I get mixed up. So, compliance programs have been around for quite a while: Antitrust, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Defense Department, things like that. But it wasn't until 1991 when the organizational sentencing guidelines came out, where they said that if you, corporation, get convicted of a crime, you will get a mitigated sentence if you have an effective compliance program in place. And they listed out 7 steps on what that means. So then that spread compliance programs more broadly. And it also led to this realization that compliance, should be a more centralized activity, right? We can manage all of our legal compliance responsibilities. We don't have them siloed off based on topic, but somebody can be in charge of the entire thing, right? But there still was a large amount of focus on just, there's bad apples out there, let's stop them, right? And then there were these other concerns about paper programs, cosmetic compliance, how do we know that these are effective? I just have to do it to please the government. Is that kind of a waste of resources? Well, let's just kind of pretend that we have a compliance program in place, a paper program. It exists on paper, but it's not really impacting individuals in the organization. And then the government won't know the difference, and we can save money. We just have to do enough to make it look like if there was a problem, that it was a bad apple, a rogue actor that did it, not us, right? At that same time, those in business ethics started to think, move away from sort of this bad apple view to let's think about the situational factor. So this was a classic article by Linda Trevino of Penn State discussing this idea of the person-situation interaction. So it's individual characteristics, situation, they kind of come together, and that will influence whether or not you follow the rules. Very famous article from 1994 in Harvard Business Review, Lynn Sharp-Payne said, well, a lot of companies, there's sort of 2 basic ways that you can implement your compliance program, right? A lot of companies will do more of its deterrence-based, right? Teach the rules, don't break the rules. If you do, you're going to get punished. But she's like, well, that's not really that effective. It doesn't take into account these situational factors, right? So compliance needs to pay attention to everything that can influence the individual. So it's much more a managerial process than it is a legal process, for example, right? And again, we have to support employees doing the right thing. So 2004, the sentencing guidelines were updated in 2 kind of key ways. One, they started referring to not just compliance programs, but compliance and ethics programs, right? The idea being that, we've got to move beyond just, hey, you complied with the law, let's focus on minimum compliance with the law, but that's not enough, right? We need to think about other aspects of being ethical, honesty, things like that showed up in codes of conduct and Sarbanes-Oxley and so on. The other big change was, in addition to implementing a compliance program, those 7 steps, you have to otherwise promote an organizational culture that encourages ethical conduct and a commitment to the compliance with the law. And they specifically cited Lynn Sharp-Payne's work, as well as interviews with others, people managers who were trying to implement compliance programs, saying, we really need to think about the whole situation, right? So we need to encourage companies to think about that. They didn't define what they meant by culture, so that was left up to companies, and there was a lot of sort of confusion early on with respect to that. So I want to give you sort of a quick overview, and I should mention I use AI for a lot of my graphics. And if you see something misspelled, AI misspells things. At first I was like, how is AI going to take over the world if it can't even spell? Then, on this chart, I made it in PowerPoint and I said turn it in to something else. I had everything spelled correctly. It came back and misspelled incentivizing. So I think AI is smart, it's just messing with me. That's what's going on there, that's what's happening. But anyway, so if there's misspelled words, that's AI doing it for you. But yeah, I'll just kind of give you a quick overview of what I think of when I think of a compliance and ethics program. And it's based on sort of the convergence of a lot of different sources out there. Sentencing guidelines, Department of Justice's evaluation of corporate compliance programs. International Standards Organization has a standard on compliance programs, 37301. They have other ones too on ethics training, whistleblowing, and specifically for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And they all are sort of pointing in the same direction. So we could categorize them differently, but it's roughly along these lines. So the leadership and governance aspect. So you have to have the tone from the top, and I'll talk about ethical leadership a little bit later. You also have to make sure the compliance officer, right? Companies that are small, at some point they've got to think about when do we need to have a human resources department, when do we need to have a standalone compliance department, right? But for bigger companies to have this, right, the compliance officer needs to have seniority, which means authority, status within the organization. So people actually listen to what he or she says. They show up at a meeting, they're not like, why is he here? What's this guy doing here, right? They understand why he's there, and they will actually listen to him or her and what they're saying. The independence to do their job appropriately. Otherwise, employees say, well, they're just there to sort of protect top management and put the blame on us because management can shut down any investigation or whatever the concern might be. Then, of course, resources to be able to do your job, collect data, analyze the data, and so on. Key first step, of course, would be your risk assessment. What are our risks of violating the legal standards as well as the ethical standards we hold ourselves to? And that allows you to do more of a risk management-based program, which is focus on the greatest areas of risk, right? If you don't have enough money, you can cover everything. Focus on what matters the most. Once you've done that, then of course develop your policies and procedures related to those, both sort of general commitments as well as more specific for different roles. Training and communications, you need to make sure that people understand the rules. I'll talk a little bit later. Training, I think, needs to go beyond that and also focus on ethical decision making in general. And communications, I don't have a bullet point on, but that's how the company communicates what's important to us. Once you've done that, then you have to incentivize compliance. So incentivizing, not so much paying you to be ethical, but that second one, making sure your program isn't encouraging wrongful behavior, right? You're not setting targets and goals so high. The only way I can do that is if I break the rules. And also the Department of Justice refers to it as consequence management. This idea, if people break the rules, you need to enforce it, right? If you're not enforcing it, I see that it's not being enforced. Like, I'm following the rules and he's breaking the rules and he's getting the bonuses and promotions. I'm not. This isn't fair. And people feel like they're not being treated fairly. They respond, right? They try to get back, right? Get back because they've been treated unfair. So you have to make sure you do that as well, fairly and consistently. Then, of course, identifying misconduct, ways for people to report problems, but then you also need to make sure you investigate. So investigate, was a rule really broken? But the investigation also needs to figure out why, right? What was the root cause of the violation? Was it because this was a bad apple? Was it because they didn't understand the rules? Was it because of our incentive program? How long has this been going on? Did people know about it, not report it? You want to get down to the root causes so then you can try to fix things, which gets to this idea of continuous improvement, right? How do we ensure that our program is working? There are challenges, right? Developing the right metrics. So it's not necessarily that easy to come up with easy outcome metrics, but maybe other things along the way. Who's using our hotline? What are they calling about? How quickly do we respond? Things like that, right? So a wide variety of ways to try to develop metrics. And then again, right, if you identify misconduct, what are the root causes? What are the changes? And then track the effectiveness of that intervention, right? How well is that working? So those are kind of the 7 categories of activities. And then, I'm not going to spend too much on this because I'll talk about all this a little bit later. It has to be embedded in this idea of a corporate culture, right? Which we'll talk about, right? It's like, what exactly does that mean? So I'll come back to all those a little bit later. So part of it is trying to figure out, what makes an effective compliance program, right? In business schools and organizational sociology, we talk about institutional theory, which is to gain legitimacy, you just look around and do what everybody else is doing, right? And there's definitely some of that going on in the spread of compliance program. We're adopting this not because we know if it's effective or not, but because the other companies in my industry are doing it, right? And so that's how things spread around. And so there's challenges to figure out what exactly is effective and what works. And the next few slides, I'll try to go relatively quickly, but from someone, who studies organizations, right? How do we empirically try to figure this out? how do compliance programs make a difference? And it's not as simple as it looks, or as you might think, I should say. So you could think about if you got the formal compliance program and then how that impacts ethical behavior, how does that impact culture? So some people phrase it as it's a mediator, meaning the formal compliance program impacts culture and that impacts ethical behavior, right? Culture is the mediator between it. Compliance program doesn't directly affect it, but it affects culture, and that's how we change things. Some people may refer to it as a moderator, which means you have a formal compliance program will impact ethical behavior, but it's moderated by the culture. If you have a strong culture, your compliance program is going to work better. If you have a weak program, it's going to not work quite as well. But then we start to test that empirically. It gets a little bit more complicated. I guess that's the third bullet point down, and the fourth one, you know, if you think about it as a moderator, the assumption is if you have a strong culture, the compliance program will work better. But if we empirically try to test that, we might say, let's put in a new intervention and see how that changes things compared to our control group. It might show up as the formal compliance program having a stronger effect when there's an unethical culture, right? Because that's when it's really needed. So how do we tease these out, try to figure it out? That's one challenge from the empirical side. Different components of the formal compliance program can impact ethical culture differently. Obviously, the quality is going to matter. A lot of early studies just used a binary variable. Hey, do you have a hotline or not? Do you have a code of conduct or not? Do you do training or not? And that's not really going to get us where we want to understand what's happening there. Some use more of a scope, which was what was the number of compliance components you had? Again, without really thinking about the quality of them. We often think about corporate culture as one thing, but it's not, right? Different teams, different departments can develop their own culture. Your sales group may have a culture completely different than your HR department or research and development or finance group, whatever the case might be. So if you aggregate it all into one measure, it obscures what's really happening, right? So we've got to go down to department or team level. A lot of people argue as well. And then there might be different ways to think about culture. Christine Parker has done a lot of research on compliance program over the last couple of decades. In one of her articles, she divided culture into compliance management and practice. That's sort of how compliance program is working on a day-to-day basis. And then compliance values, kind of down there in green, which was this general sense, hey, if employees' views, if your company violated the law, would you feel shame? Do you have to feel like we have a moral obligation to follow the corporate law, or whatever the case might be? And then, so the formal system, one in blue, will impact the purple one, compliance management and practice, but it's moderated by the compliance values, and compliance values also impacts that. So there's many different ways to think about this. And so the idea, my little quick tour, was to try to show empirically from the business school side, management scholar side, how tough some of this can be to show what truly is effective, right? So the model I like to use, which might be a little harder to test empirically, but it was developed by some business ethics scholars a while back, is to think about the formal compliance program, which is embedded in the informal, which I'll talk about more in a second, which is then embedded within the overall organizational climate. So organizational scholars distinguish between culture and climate. They're somewhat similar, but they are different. So the climate is sort of employees' general perceptions of, does my organization support ethics? Does my organization treat people with respect? Things like that. Do they treat people fairly? And the climate constrains the informal, which then also constrains the formal program, right? So the formal program is not going to be effective unless it's aligned with those other aspects. But one nice, many things, but one nice thing I have in that bottom bullet point is when you think about climate, it's not unusual for managers to say, well, all right, maybe we've got an ethical issue over here on harassment, bullying, whatever, but that's not going to have any impact on issues over here in financial reporting or whatever the case might be. And it's, well, if you think about the climate, No, it all works its way up there into how this organization thinks ethics is important, or how we treat people, and it will spread across the organization and impact your efforts, right? So the ethical issues can't be siloed and think that one won't harm the other. This is one way to think about that. So thinking about the informal side, and this might be more what people think about when they think about corporate culture, is sort of, what's going on in your day-to-day life, right? What impacts you? So a long time ago, someone at the medical school told me how he teaches ethics, what they discovered, which is called the hidden curriculum. In this context, that means when you're a med student, you spend the first year or two in the classroom, and you learn all the stuff you need to learn to be a doctor, but you also learn certain professional responsibilities, how you deal with patients, so on and so forth, right? Bedside manner. Then you go do your rotations. You do the emergency room, surgery, dermatology, internal medicine, all of that stuff. But that's when you learn really to be a doctor. So this is the show ER. If you're familiar with that, I think it was on for like 72 years or something like that. And now the guy in the white, Dr. Carter, he now works in Pittsburgh apparently on HBO, but he had to change his name for legal reasons. There's a lawsuit going on there with Michael Crichton, I think. But this is the episode that this guy used. This is from the very season 1, episode 1. Dr. Carter there in the white coat, he's the medical student. Showing up in the emergency room day 1. Dr. Benton, the guy in all blue standing beside him, is a surgeon, showing him how you do things. In this short little 4 or 5 minute clip, you'll see all these different things that Dr. Benton marked everything stacked, because otherwise people won't do it. He kind of misrepresents some things to a patient, not to manipulate them. He's like, well, they won't understand if I frame it this way, so I frame it this other way, and that makes more sense. And Dr. Carter's kind of just watching, soaking it in. Dr. Carter asks a question, he gets yelled at, right? You should know this. How come you don't know that, right? So there's a bunch of different things going on, and you can quickly see how what's happening on the floor is very different from what you learned in the classroom, right? So that's why it's called the hidden curriculum. You need to pay attention to that, right? So it's the same thing in organizations, right? You have to pay attention to what the organizational culture is, and then attempt to manage that, right? That last bullet point, culture is going to shape itself no matter what. So you better pay attention to it and try to shape it as you can. And we'll talk later on some ideas on how to do that. And then the last one, the other part is, again, this climate, which is sort of the general perceptions in the organization that ethics is important. Are you supposed to focus on self-interest, things like that? There can be certain situations where the authors of that article argue, you might be better off if you didn't have an ethical infrastructure or try to implement one at all. Things would be better off, right? Because you've done it so poorly, you've made things worse. And one way to explain that is, right, people know who that guy is? This will show your age. The old Paper Chase show. Anyway, when I was a kid, we watched the Paper Chase movie. John Houseman, law professor on the show. Let's imagine your law school, right? You've got a professional responsibility course. The dean's office also says, well, that's great, but we also want ethics across the curriculum. So we want each class to also touch on ethics. We think that's important. So John Houseman says, all right, my business associations class, he's at the dean's office, says I need to talk about ethics. So we got about 15 minutes to do that. Here's the issue. What do you think? Yeah, okay. Anybody else? Done? Good. Can we get back to the real stuff of corporate law? Right? That sends the message, this ethics stuff doesn't matter. Right? You don't need to worry about that. You just have to focus on these other things. So we would have been better off if John Houseman didn't discuss it at all. Because now he has just completely delegitimized it. It's the same idea, right? If you have a compliance program that is clearly just a cosmetic program, just a paper program, that can actually make things worse than better. And there's some empirical research related to that as well. So, looking at humans in organizations, I want to just kind of a very quick tour of some of the main things of behavioral ethics, and then we'll get into managing corporate cultures. So, you've probably heard 10-80-10 rule. It's used in many, many different places, right? There's no empirical backing behind it in this context, but the same general concept applies, that you're going to have 10% of the people who are always going to be unethical, right? So I teach business ethics sometimes, and a lot of people say, well, you know, so-and-so took business ethics class, and now they're in jail for insider trading, so clearly your class doesn't work. That's not what I do in a business ethics class, right? I can't, you know, get some bad person, turn them into a good person. I can help people who want to do the right thing understand how to do that better, but we can't take bad people and turn them into good people, right? So compliance programs, right, you definitely need to focus on that 10% who are always unethical, but you can't have your exclusive focus on that, right? That's just not going to work, and it could actually end up being counterproductive to this middle 80%, right, who depends on the situation, right? They can be influenced by what's going on around them, and they can be pushed in certain directions without even realizing it necessarily, right? And then you've got the 10% who are always going to be that. So, this will be kind of a quick random walk in a famous article from law school, random walk through some behavioral ethics things, and then we'll kind of bring it together in about 5 or 6 slides here. So you've probably heard of System 1 and System 2 things, thinking fast and thinking slow. Thinking fast, right, that's more the automatic, heuristic-based and so on. And behavioral ethics, a lot of area of research thinks that you're much more likely to be self-interested. That's your initial response, right? There is some research that says, well, your intuition is typically correct, but under this sort of default interventionist theory, System 1 kind of gives you that default response, which is more likely to be self-interest. You see a conflict of interest, you're more likely to engage in it because that's immediate response to you, and you'll take that over your professional responsibility. System 2 may intervene and override that and say, no, you know what, that's not right. You shouldn't do that. But it doesn't always happen for a variety of reasons. So, people familiar with the trolley problem? Anybody not familiar with the trolley problem? It's been around for a while. So the idea of the trolley problem is you got a trolley coming down the road, track, I guess. The trolley's coming down the track, and it's headed right towards 4 or 5 people. And you're like, oh, this is horrible. What am I going to do? Then you look down, you're standing by a lever, and you realize, oh, if I pull this lever, that'll shift the track, and it'll go down this way, and it's only going to hurt one person. So you say, would you pull the lever or not? And 80% of people in various studies say, yeah, I'd do that. I'd pull the lever because it's better to save 5 lives than just to save 1. That makes sense, right? That's one standard utilitarian thinking. You familiar with the footbridge problem variation? So now, I see the trolley going down the track, going right towards 5 people. And I'm, oh man, I wish there was a lever I could pull, but there's no lever. And I'm on a bridge, the train's going underneath me, and there's a very large person next to me. And I quickly surmise, well, if I knock them over, they're going to fall on the track, and that's going to stop the trolley. So do you do that? Only about 20% of people do that, right? And why? Well, it's probably much more, that's why I've got the rabbit in this picture. The rabbit's the one deciding, right? It's that System 1 thinking, right? You're like, this just seems wrong, it doesn't seem right. You know, emotionally, you got that sort of visceral response. I'm not going to do that. So you don't do that, right? So we see this big difference between the two. And there's actually some interesting research that supports sort of what I was just describing, which is if you have people read these separate problems, and you compare them to people reading their native language, so for me, English, and you compare it to somebody else, like if I had to read it in French. I can kind of make it out, but it takes me a while, so it slows me down. So in the footbridge problem, right, it's more likely, because you're slowed down, that System 2 thinking is more likely to kick in, right? And then you say, well, they're roughly the same, so I should, right? So there's some empirical research to support what I just described. So to bring it back to business ethics, one study asked people, all right, you're going for a job interview. The interviewer starts asking inappropriate questions. Are you dating anybody? Are they attractive? Things like that, right? Completely inappropriate. 68% of the people said, I would never answer that. No way. 28% of the people said I would tell them that's wrong, or I would just get up and leave. So then we put them in that situation, and what happens? Nobody does any of that, right? So when you think about what you're going to do, you got that system two thinking. You think more about abstract principles, things like that. Oh, I'd be angry, and that's wrong. Of course I would stand up and talk to them. But then you put people in the situation, and the system one kicks in and says, I just want to get out of this situation. You have much more of that emotional, visceral response to what's going on, right? So then what do you do when you realize that your actions didn't match up with what you thought you would do in a classroom or ethics training or something like that, right? And that's where rationalization's coming. So the B.F. Goodrich aircraft brake scandal was in the late 1960s, somewhere down by, B.F. Goodrich is somewhere down by Dayton. I don't remember the name of the city.
Akron.
It's in Akron? Is that where it is?
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay. I was wrong. Anyway, maybe Kermit Vanderveer, one guy who wrote the story, was similar. But so after the scandal happened, Kermit Vanderveer, who was working there, wrote an article kind of describing from his perspective what happened. So his argument was we were being asked to draft a report that essentially lied about the testing of the brakes. There are certain standards you're supposed to follow when you test the brakes. We manipulated that all over left and right, and now our bosses are telling us to write a report saying that, yeah, these passed the test, right? So there are quotes from people like, hey, we're just drawing some curves. Whatever happens to them when they leave, we're not responsible for that. I had no control over this thing. Why should my conscience bother me? Technically, what we're doing, I don't think what we're doing could really be fraud. It's not right, but technically it's not fraud. And then I refuse to take part. If I refuse to take part, I would have to resign or be fired. Somebody would still write the report, right? So nothing would change. Bills aren't paid with personal satisfaction or house payments with ethical principles, right? So those are all forms of rationalizations, all right? So rationalizations are things you either tell yourself right before you do something wrong, or afterwards, how you justify what you did. It wasn't that bad. It's moral disengagement, right? He makes it psychologically easier for you to say, I did a bad thing, but I'm not a bad person. Well, I guess it wasn't that bad of a thing. It was an exception to the norm, right? These are just some kind of classic examples of rationalizations. So that is what gets you on sort of the proverbial slippery slope. And so my AI pictures, after a while, because I'm so used to misspelling words, I'm like, is that how you really spell egregious? Is that right? But so the idea of the slippery slope is you have your ethical standard. You're tempted to do something you know is wrong. You find a way to rationalize it, or afterwards you rationalize it. So you went a little bit past it. Now that's your new ethical standard. And then the next deviation is compared to your new ethical standard, right? And you deviate. And so you see how it just keeps getting lower and lower and lower. And you get to this point where you're engaging in behavior that you never in the world would have thought you would have done. Or if somebody from the outside comes in and looks at your organization, they're like, how did you not think you were going to get caught doing this, right? But it's just that very slow process. You don't realize it's happening. There is a classic example. I'll try to be quick. What was it? Bernard Bradstreet was considered to be a highly ethical CEO. This was a company, one of Kurzweil's companies. He's the guy, the reason you can talk to your Siri, stuff like that, talk to your phone. So this was a software, speech recognition software they're selling to hospitals. They said, we got to meet our numbers. We got an IPO coming up. We want the IPO to be good. So we got to make sure we meet our numbers, right, every quarter. So time one comes up, like, oh, we're so close, we're just a little bit short. And somebody's like, well, this hospital, they're going to sign the contract. It's just going to take them a couple days to get, get the boss to sign it, whatever. But it's going to be signed, 100% guaranteed. So the CEO is like, all right, let's do it. So they ship the software off to a warehouse. Hey, it left our facilities. We can count that as a sale. Next quarter comes around, they're a little bit short. And somebody's like, well, it'll be about 2 weeks, and then this hospital's definitely going to buy it. Like, let's count that, right? The next quarter, like, well, anybody, just any time restriction. Then they got to the point where they're forging customer signatures on sales. Like, they will definitely buy it. They bought it last year, so they'll buy the upgrade. Let's just sign their name on it. Then they just like find any hospital. Atlanta, there's a hospital. Find that CEO and just write their name on this thing and sell that, count that as revenue today. And then the auditors started asking questions about, I heard there was some warehouse where you guys have a bunch of software. So like, oh, let's quickly move that, right? So they went from a very small deviation to get worse and worse and worse, right? And if you look at corporate scandals, that's typically how it happens, right? It's not you wake up one day and say, I'm going to commit this huge fraud, right? It's just these small steps that lead people to down that slippery slope. So to try to bring these together, Ted Brunzel and colleagues talk about the want versus should problem, right? The want self, similar to system one, bias toward self-interest, and the should self is more the system to deliver controlled thinking, right? You know what you should do. So you know what you should do. Your face pressure, so your want self takes over. Then you look back and you rationalize it. And now you're on a slippery slope, right? So that's how these processes start at any time. So what should compliance do about that? Generally, you want to support the should self, try to raise awareness of people rationalizing, and then try to help people from getting on that slippery slope. So just in the interest of time, this is a slide I often use in my MBA business ethics class when I talk to them, is one of the things that people need to do, and compliance needs to help and support them in doing, right, is before a dilemma, you need to think about not just, all right, what are the rules, what would I do in this situation? But you really need to do like a role play, case study, figure out how will this issue come up? Right? Not just in the abstract, oh, if your boss actually do what, but all right, here's the situation, here's what you'll be feeling, here's your team members pressuring you. You got to think more about how it will come up, right? So when it does happen, you're better prepared and you don't just have that sort of system one response of like, oh, I need to get out of this situation and get gone, right? So the better prepared for everything, the more likely you are to follow through. Got to find ways in the dilemmas to sort of make sure you do consider these ethical principles, and if you start hearing yourself using these rationalizations, recognizing that, I'll talk about giving voice to values later. And then, of course, after a dilemma, you don't want to be on that slippery slope. So if you mess up, right, you can't use rationalization. You've got to take, what that growth mindset of, hey, I didn't live up to what I should have done. Why not? What can I learn from that to do better next time? Right? So taking that different mental approach can make a huge difference, A, to do better in the future, but also to avoid that slippery slope. So, situational factors. This is the woman there on the right. I just saw something in the news recently. A senator, I think, had a big sign he had up when he was giving a speech. Same woman, same outfit, everything. So she gets around, whoever her name is, right? But here, she's telling me to do something wrong. So I'll just move very quickly on sort of well-known kind of situational factors that push people. One is this idea of obedience to authority. If you're ever familiar with the Milgram experiments is the most famous one, right? Where, hey, this person has authority. They must know what they're doing. He or she's the boss. I'm just doing what I was told, right? Conformity, that's everyone is doing it. If you've ever read Robert Cialdini's book on influence and persuasion, he phrases it as social proof, right? We look to others to determine what it is we should do in this situation, right? Pluralistic ignorance is that no one is doing it, right? So you see something wrong and you're kind of unsure, should I speak up? What should I do? And you look around, nobody else is doing anything, so I guess not doing anything is the correct response. But in this quote, right, no one is certain, but everyone's certain, everybody else is certain, right? So we're all going through that same mental process. We don't do anything. And then the last one, there's more, and this is just a quick summary. Diffusion of responsibility, which is there's an inverse relationship between my sense of responsibility and the number of people who saw it as well, right? So if I see somebody doing something wrong at work, but then I see there's 10 other people who see it too, I'm like, well, somebody else will clearly report it. I don't need to get involved, that type of thing, right? That's that idea of diffusion of responsibility, and there's many examples we could use, but one is from General Motors. when they had their ignition switch scandal about 15, 17 years ago, something like that. There was a problem, the ignition switch would fail and the car would stall, you're driving down the highway, right? Extremely dangerous. They knew about it for a while, but they didn't fix it. The internal investigation afterwards, our independent investigation afterward, one of the things they talked about was there was the GM nod. And the picture wasn't in the independent investigator's report. The lawyers don't draw pictures. That was probably, I don't know, Wall Street Journal or something. It says, when you're confronted with the problem, you're just like, that's the GM solution. They'll take care of it. I'm not going to do it, right? So you've got these and others, sort of very, very common, natural behavioral responses to situations, right? People have these natural tendencies, right? It's very, very common. Then you put that in an environment, all right, probably more accurately would say the climate, to use our words, that is not supportive of doing the right thing, then this wrongdoing just continues to spread and spread and spread. Nobody's speaking up, nobody's doing anything about it. So just a couple examples. This is Barclays Bank, had the LIBOR scandal, whatever that was, 15 years ago or so. So there was an LIBOR interest rate. They used the interest rates daily from like 18 banks or so, and they throw out the bottom three and the top three, and then average the rest, and that's the LIBOR rate. So Barclays would be like, well, we want the interest rate to be lower today. That would help us. So they will falsely claim that they use a higher rate because they're going to take up one of those three spots that push, right, that change what's going on, right, push the rest up, I guess. So the independent investigation solves report after. So there was a culture of fear of not achieving targets. The compensation system rewarded revenue generation rather than serving the interests of customers. No common purpose, no values to guide our behavior. Senior management didn't want to hear bad news, and if you brought it to us, they'd punish it, right? So you can imagine how those factors are going to work together with these factors synergistically just to make things worse and worse and worse, and wrongdoing spreads. KPMG used to do these integrity surveys every couple of years. They'd ask people, managers, what's the root cause of misconduct in your organization? It's not the bad apple, right? Pressure, do whatever it takes. Believe the code of conduct's not taken seriously. I don't have the resources to do my job. I'll get rewarded for the means. Those types of things, right? Those are all, again, going to work that climate where ethics doesn't matter. Self-interest, focusing on the bottom line is all that matters. Right? Just make things worse and worse and worse. Nobody's reporting the problems, and so on. So, what can we do in an organization to try to improve the corporate culture, right? So this is kind of 4, sort of 5, very simple things, kind of, again, this is, we could go into more depth on each of these, but sort of 4 basic kind of building blocks, or whatever metaphor you want to use. One is trying to manage the social. So informal system, and this would also impact the ethical climate, even though I don't have it there. So think about, heroes in organizations, right? They personify who in the organization represents the values that you have, right? It could be a negative. At Enron, they held a woman out for developing these new sort of derivatives, and she took a huge risk, and she got this big financial reward from it. All these things that focus not on teamwork and do what's right for the company, but individual self-interest, pushing the envelope, taking risks, right? That's the type of person we want, versus an organization where it's someone who follows the rules and does what they're supposed to. It's kind of linked also to the bottom one about stories, right? Because they give you that sort of detail, right? Stories can bring up emotions, have the context, the nuance, that can inform people what it is we value, right? So stories could be bad things, like in that GM case, there was one of the safety quality people was like, well, how come you didn't do your job and report this problem, right, earlier? He's like, well, I heard what happened to the guy who was in my role before me. He's not here anymore, right? So those stories could be like that. Or there could be stories, this is the one I've used for 20 years, that's so long now that I forget what organization it was even in. It's probably been told in different organizations as well, maybe apocryphal. But the CEO is going out to visit different branch offices or factories, and he or she shows up at the door, and the security guard is like, where's your ID? The CEO's like, left it in my other jacket. I don't have it with me, right? And the guard's like, can't let you in. And everybody, you know, the CEO's minions are like, that guy's so getting fired, right? But instead, the story is, right, the CEO's like, that's right, I shouldn't go in. Everybody follows the rules in this organization. There's no exception for anyone, right? So that's a story that gets passed along throughout the organization, right? So you've got to pay attention to these things, just like young Dr. Carter on the medical floor in the ER with Dr. Ben. You've got to figure out, what are those stories being told? Do we need to step in, try to change perception, manage those as well? Building a speak-up culture. This is where, misspelled word. Futility is what that's supposed to say. Fear and futility is the problem, right? If I report something, I will get retaliated against, and the company's not going to do anything anyway, so why would I do that? So, right, you can't just have your hotline or whatever's out there. You actually have to manage the process, right? Make sure employees understand, hey, if you report something, look, we solved it, right? Nobody was retaliated against, the problem was solved, so you have to actively manage the information that's going on about it. In addition, you don't want people just to report what they see. You also want them to ask when they have questions, right? A lot of organizations have an old California Management Review article called the moral muteness problem. People are afraid to speak up. It feels like I'm being confrontational. There we go. But AI is messing with my speech too. Confrontational, idealistic, it's distracting, right? So even if I'll speak up about an operational issue, research shows you don't on the ethical side, right? So you need to make sure, how can we ensure that people ask questions and feel comfortable doing so? So some various tips, active listening, training managers on that, sort of making sure you're not interrupting, you're not making certain assumptions about what they're saying, actively soliciting voice, going around and asking for opinions. Because otherwise you've got that diffusion of responsibility. I don't want to step up and say something. Somebody else they'll say it, right? But if you actually, hey, tell me what's going on, then you might be more likely to hear it. Training people, so giving voice to values is this framework developed by Mary Gentile. It's been used by some companies like Lockheed Martin is using it. And the general idea is to train employees in the skills that they need to discuss these types of issues, right? So one of our things is not so much going in and sort of questioning somebody's integrity, they're going to get defensive, but to treat this discussion like you would any negotiation. How would you prepare for a negotiation? Same thing. What are the other side's interests? What do they care about? What are the pressures on them, right? So what's the phrase? Walk a mile in somebody's shoes, right? The same thing, right? Figuring that out. Figuring out if you have certain points of leverage you can use to try to change their opinion, right? So she's got a whole framework that we can train employees on, which is different than just training, here's the rules, don't break the rules, but we're supporting them in being ethical. Incentives, of course, there's many, many examples of incentives that have too high of goals and just push, there's no way you can succeed unless you break the rules, right? So compliance needs to be involved when you're implementing new compensation programs, as well as evaluating how they're doing. And then there are other sort of red flags that can pop up. Research has shown certain situations where people are more likely to feel the temptation and give into the temptation. If you view a bonus as something, I've got this bonus for the last 5 years, now I'm falling a little bit short, you start to view that as a loss, and then if it's loss aversion, people are more willing to take risks than they otherwise would if it was just to try to get a gain. So that mental framework can change, right? So you have to either change them or monitor those situations more carefully. The last one, ethical leadership. So we would all if we were to say, what's a moral person? What do they have? What are their traits? What are behaviors? Things like that. We would come up with a list like that, right? So a manager needs to be that, but they also need to be a moral manager, right? Where you actually role model behavior, right? Showing that you're not using rationalizations, that you're following what the rules are, you say your company's values are, that you actually follow through. There's a lot of research on compliance programs, codes of ethics, things like that. If there's follow through, if there's enforcement, then empirically we show that they work. But otherwise, if they just look there and there's not enforced, it can actually make things worse, right? So you have to make sure that you're actually holding people accountable when they violate the rules, you're communicating things. So then if you're both a moral person and a moral manager, that's what they call an ethical leader, right? If not, if you're just the moral person, you don't do the moral manager part, then people start to view it just sort of this bottom line mentality. The bottom line's all that matters. That's what the organization clearly wants me to do. So then all those things would hopefully feed into an ethical climate, which again is that broader perception amongst employees. Does my organization support ethics? Does it treat people with respect? Does it treat people fairly? And that constrains, those perceptions constrain the other aspects beneath it. One last slide. I used to sort of try to, there's the old law school joke where you refine your outline down and down and down till you get it to just one word for your class, and then you forget the word. So this is the idea of purpose, incentives, leadership, and ethics, is to try to get at a lot of things that I just talked about, right? In a very simple, overly concise way. Purpose, right? What are our core values? Do our incentives align with that? And are we actually holding people accountable? Leadership, right? Don't just be the moral person, but be an ethical leader as well. And then ethics, how do we show that we actually value those core values within the organization? Do we encourage people to speak up on ethical beliefs? And then do the social norms, how people talk and behave on the floor, match up with what we want them to do? So the acronym is PILE, which is, not the best. That's why I don't use that. But, all right, I was trying to talk fast. I'm going to a little over my 45 minutes. But if there are any questions or comments, I would be happy to hear.
Does anyone have any questions?
So excellent presentation, really enjoyable. I have the question that I think most people have in regard to compliance right now. Things are shifting. For example, we had Hester Peirce here a couple of weeks ago. Thank you. With the Ohio Securities Conference, and she was talking about cryptocurrency regulation, which Commissioner Crenshaw has referred to it as being crypto whiplash. For the Gary Gensler version of the SEC, everything was a problem, everything was a security, and there was going to be a whole bunch of regulation. For the Hester Peirce, Paul Atkins version, absolutely nothing. So, if you're trying to build this culture, build an environment that has this virtuous cycle as you're talking about, how do you do that in a world of shifting regulation? And what do you do where that shifting regulation at one point goes from highly regulated to almost zero regulation, and at some point is going to bounce back to high regulation again?
Good question. Excellent. So many other aspects. Right? I'm not as familiar with what's happened with corporate crime enforcement in the last 10, 11 months, but similar things too, right? One of the things that drives compliance program adoption is, hey, if we get in trouble, we know the Department of Justice is going to pull out that evaluation of corporate compliance programs memo and look and see what we're doing. But if they're not using that, they're not enforcing corporate crime. Like we said, we're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Those types of things, what incentive does that have? So one aspect, I guess, would be you don't know what the future is, right? There's uncertainty about the future. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, we know, is it a 5-year or 7-year statute of limitations on that? So, new administration, things could change. So I assume the same thing with cryptocurrency regulation and things like that. You can't go all in, put all your eggs in the basket in one direction because you don't know when it's going to change, right? And, problems so when Siemens, whenever that was, 2007, 2008, got in trouble for violations, corruption, paying bribes, right? It used to be in Germany, you could deduct, you weren't, for bribing a foreign, domestic official, that's a crime. Bribing a foreign official, not a crime. And in fact, you can deduct those expenses from your taxes, right? And so that mentality was embedded within Siemens managers. So when the new laws were passed, they had a hard time adjusting to that new reality, right? So I would think sort of a similar mindset is if you don't know where regulation is going to go, I wouldn't go all in, because how are you going to pull them back to adjust to what the rules are going to be? So you need to make your own company's decision on what you want your values to be and where they are, and try to act more consistently with that. I guess that would be my initial thoughts anyway.
What was the next one?
Thank you. Yep. So in the modernization of compliance, there's the rise of monitoring. And I'm wondering, when it comes to moral obligation and moral decision making, if you have seen in your research, or if you have any thoughts about moral decision making in the context of monitoring, where people in an organization know that they're being watched, or that their decisions are being reviewed, and if you think that has any impact on the effectiveness of monitoring as a compliance mechanism.
So I go back to my silly pictures here. It plays into some of this, right? Which is, so there's always concerns about crowding out, right? Your intrinsic belief to follow the rules. If we crowd out, then it just depends on extrinsic and blah, blah, that type of idea. So if you're being watched, you know you're going to be watched. How are employees perceiving that? Are they perceiving it as, the company doesn't trust me, so they're watching everything I do? That's going to evoke one reaction. Or if you have a climate of ethics, fairness, and respect, then it's perceived completely differently. Oh, this is fair. It's making sure everybody's following the rules like we should. It's making sure our company is ethically compliant, right? So you've got to manage how employees perceive those types of things. I guess that would be my sort of initial response. Does that make sense? So the same actions by managers could look very different in organization A versus organization B based on the ethical climate of that organization.
Hello, I liked that acronym PILE.
Oh, you like that?
Yeah.
I was worried when people say, what, a pile of what?
Well, no, it's for PhD, piled higher and deeper. Remember that old joke? Piled higher and deeper. Well, no, but my question is about credentials too. So I respect your extra credentials, JD and PhD. Have you noticed in your academic experience that there is a difference in decision makings by PhDs versus JDs, or the ones who have both credentials?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, my bias, and my apologies. I was an undergrad economics major, but my bias, I always make fun of economics PhDs, right? They just think about the rational person, self-interested stuff. They don't care about the doing things for ethical, moral, social reasons. So I make fun of them probably unfairly. But otherwise, I don't think I have really noticed the difference. You know, I mean, I definitely in the business school, I still get these questions, right? Maybe it's more from the finance and accounting, and economists, still make fun of accountants, of, you know, what I was saying before about you can't teach people ethics, right? They're MBA students, 28, 30 years old. How do you teach somebody ethics? And it's like, well, you understand what we're trying to do, right? You have to have a good faith belief that you want to get better. If you don't want that, then yeah, there's nothing I can do for you in that sense. But otherwise, I mean, just off the top of my head anyway, I can't think of it.
Is it always a problem with System 1? You know, it seemed like you were putting a lot of emphasis on System 1 being a problem, you know, sort of this initial impulse that I should act in a self-interested way. I'm wondering, can System 1 ever be useful, and are there things in regard to System 2? And I thought of this while you were talking about diffusion of responsibility. There's also delusion of responsibility or lack thereof, where there's this othering of the criminal justice system is for other people, not for me, that seems to lead to a lot of people wearing orange jumpsuits who commit white-collar crime. You know, how much of this should be attributed to System 2? Are there problems with System 2? Are there instances where System 1 might, you know, save us, where System 2 has problems?
I mean, so there's a lot of research in this area. There's a lot of people, and there's some interesting research within business ethics as well as psychology in general, which is, Jonathan Haidt might be one of the people too, the argument is your intuition is typically correct, which is to say system 1 gives you the right answer, and any system 2 thinking is just coming up saying what you already decided, right? So there are definitely some people who make that argument, and there's some empirical research in support of that. There's other research, as I described, which it's much more, your initial response is more sort of the self-preservation, self-interested side, and you need to think about it more, bring in that system 2 thinking. But going back to the James Rest model, if your system 2 thinking is not using very good judgment, then you're still not going to be any better off, right? You may have thought about it harder, but you're not thinking about it the right way. You're not considering the right factors, things like that. So it's it's not perfect, but the idea is in this context was if you've had ethics training, responsibility, you know what the rules are and what you should do. We want to make sure that that's more salient when the time comes to act, so you're more likely to think about what can we do there. But there is a lot of work on that intuition side.
So I think we're a little bit past the hour even, but I want to thank David for an absolutely fabulous presentation. Thanks to everybody for attending.
Yeah, thank you for coming.